It was either here or Newmarket, Ontario. One or the other. And that's where John was born. So we had to...
It still does to this day. I look at, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and that performance of Del Griffith. I believe that would be not...
Find joy. I think if I define joy, time is like usually associated with joy,
The lights flash, the cameras roar, and one man walks the carpet alone. Ryan Reynolds steps into the night. Without the woman who once stood beside him at every premiere, this was supposed to be his moment, his tribute, his triumph. But something in the air feels off colder than usual. The whispers spread faster than the flashes. Where is Blake Lively, and why is she gone from his side? Because behind that smile and behind that red carpet glow hides the secret fracture that Hollywood never wanted us to see the night. Ryan Reynolds arrived at the Toronto Film Festival was not just another premiere. It was a silent confession, wrapped in designer suits and polished charm, as the world watched him stand beneath the bright lights he was no longer. The man who cracked jokes on late-night stages, or the husband who made the internet melt with birthday posts. He was something different. Something calculating, a performer stepping onto the biggest stage of his career without the one person who had always shared the spotlight. His wife, Blake Lively, had vanished from the cameras. No glamour, no glitter, no smiles, just absence. The kind of silence that says more than any public statement ever could, while photographers shouted his name in flashes. Carved white lines into the night sky. His mother stood beside him, smiling, proud, steady, but even that warmth couldn't mask what was missing. Because this wasn't just a red carpet. It was a battlefield. Ryan had spent years shaping this documentary, about John Candy pouring his creative soul into it. But the story that night wasn't about Candy. It was about what Ryan wasn't saying. What he wasn't showing the truth, that for the first time in years, he needed to protect himself from the chaos that surrounded his wife and the headlines that threatened to devour his image behind the velvet ropes and the polite smiles. The truth moved like smoke, ungraspable. But everywhere the audience saw a solo appearance. But insiders knew this. Was a carefully crafted decision. Ryan had made the call to step into the spotlight alone, to shield his project, his legacy from the storm that had followed Blake through courtrooms and headlines. This wasn't about marriage anymore, it was about survival. The whispers grew. Blake Lively, absent from her husband's biggest premiere, was like a missing verse in a love song that used to play perfectly. Now the melody had cracks, the harmony broken. Ryan didn't flinch. He smiled for every photo, stood for every camera, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a distance, an exhaustion that no amount of acting could hide. And as he faced the reporters and journalists asking polite questions about his film, he delivered his lines smoothly rehearsed, about creativity, about legacy, about kindness, but even his words felt like armor. He claimed he never punches down, never hurts anyone, only himself yet. For those who had followed the rumors that statement hit differently, the crowd outside felt it. Two fans who had waited for hours expecting warmth were met with silence. Ryan walked past them, unseeing, untouching, detached. The man once known for engaging humor was now a shadow of himself, locked in an invisible cage of pressure and scrutiny. What he didn't know was that those small choices, ignoring fans, walking alone, smiling too perfectly, would ignite the story that Hollywood had been waiting for. Because this was no ordinary night. This was the beginning of a public unraveling one that would blur the lines between loyalty, ambition, and the true cost of fame. The days that followed the Toronto Film Festival premiere became a storm of whispers and clues, a puzzle pieced together by those who sensed that something far greater than a missed red carpet appearance was at play. Ryan Reynolds had built a reputation as the charming man of Hollywood, the relatable husband, the playful internet hero, whose marriage to Blake Lively was once the gold standard of celebrity love. But that image was starting to slip away like sand through fingers, and every move he made only deepened the mystery. When the first fans noticed that Ryan had erased old photos of Blake from his social media, they thought it was a glitch, then a reset, maybe even a publicity trick. But it wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, calculated, and cold years of carefully curated posts that had shaped their relationship into a global brand were gone. Without warning, one by one, the pieces disappeared. The playful banter, the public affection, the posts that had once defined them all replaced by silence for the first time in over a decade. Ryan didn't post about Blake's birthday. The internet noticed immediately, headlines erupted, speculation. soared, and the silence became the loudest message of all people who had followed their story for years, began to wonder what had changed, what had broken behind the scenes. The answer was quietly spreading among insiders. Ryan had made a decision to protect his brand at all costs, and that meant creating distance not just emotionally but publicly. His film had been years in the making, a tribute to a man he admired, and he refused to let Blake's ongoing legal turmoil overshadow it. Her lawsuits, her controversies, her absence from the red carpet, it was all becoming too heavy, too unpredictable, and so he pulled away. Even if that meant doing it under the bright glare of the cameras. What made it more telling was who did show up beside him. His mother. Not Blake. His sister, not Blake. Every detail told its own story, a family rallying around him while he silently closed the door on the chaos outside. But the tension didn't stop there the moment he limited the comments on his movie. Promotions fans knew something was wrong. Every post that should have celebrated his creative work was flooded with criticism and references to Blake's lawsuit. The connection between his career and her controversies had become unavoidable, and Ryan could see it unraveling. His own reputation was now at risk. The man who had always played the part of the witty everyman was being dragged into something darker, a reality where every action, every silence, and every photo was dissected by millions. But this wasn't just about reputation, it was about identity. Ryan Reynolds had spent his career mastering the art of control, of image control, of tone control, of narrative. Yet at that moment, control was slipping through his hands. His red carpet smiles now looked like shields. His interviews rehearsed not with joy, but with strategy. When he spoke about kindness and moral high ground, his words felt heavy, rehearsed like a man trying to convince himself more than his audience. He spoke of lessons learned from John Candy, of not punching down, of being compassionate. But his own actions seemed to betray those words, especially to those who remembered the long-running tension between Ryan and Justin Baldoni, and the whispers that had followed their feud for years. Even the entertainment press began to question if Ryan's own projects had quietly taken aim at his critics and rivals, and whether his art had become a stage for subtle revenge behind all the charisma and the charm. There was now a shadow of something else, something colder. The truth was that the Toronto premiere wasn't just about promoting a documentary. It was Ryan Reynolds quietly stepping into a new chapter 1, where the man behind the jokes was beginning to fracture under the weight of his own image. And while the cameras flashed and fans cheered, what they didn't realize was that the story unfolding was far bigger than a marriage. It was a mirror reflecting how easily fame can turn affection into armor and love into strategy. As the spotlight dimmed on the Toronto red carpet, the story of Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively began to twist into something even more complex, and quietly devastating whispers inside the industry hinted that Ryan's decision to appear without Blake was not an act of defiance, but a survival move, a calculated attempt to separate his rising tension-filled world from the legal storm that had consumed hers. Yet what followed only intensified the scrutiny, because the people who had once cheered for them as Hollywood's golden couple were now watching every breath, every look, and every silence. Ryan's loyal online persona, once defined by warmth and self-deprecating humor, began to fracture, replaced by cautious distance and tightly crafted words. It was as though he had begun building invisible walls between himself and the public. His jokes, once effortless, now sounded heavy, rehearsed. Even defensive interviews became quieter. Smiles, more forced eyes, more tired. And when fans gathered again, hoping for that familiar spark of connection, they were met with the same cold detachment that had defined his tiff appearance. Witnesses described how he walked past them without a glance, how security formed a wall between him and the crowd, and how even the smallest gestures of acknowledgement were missing. This wasn't arrogance, it was fear. A kind of fear that only those who have seen reputations slip understand. Behind the scenes, the conversation wasn't just about Blake's legal battles anymore. It was about the collateral damage, the growing tension between the couple, and how every public moment now risked becoming a headline. Those close to the situation hinted that Ryan had quietly told his team to manage appearances, carefully to ensure that no question about Blake could derail his film's narrative. But controlling a story in the age of social media is like trying to catch smoke. And no matter how precise or careful he tried to be, fans were already dissecting. Everything. His silence became evidence, his smiles became clues, and his absence from Blake's public moments turned into questions that no one on his team could answer. Blake, for her part, seemed to respond in subtle ways through carefully worded posts through hints and small gestures meant to reclaim a sense of control. She smiled for cameras at her own events and spoke about empowerment. Yet her voice trembled in small ways that only those truly watching could see what was once a shared dream had turned into two separate performances, each partner trying to manage their image under the harsh light of global attention. What no one expected, however, was how the legal chaos surrounding Blake would begin to ripple through the Hollywood elite, drawing unexpected names into the storm. When Justin Baldoni's legal team referenced Taylor Swift's lyrics in their filings, it became clear this was no ordinary dispute. It was a calculated strike meant to pierce through public image and symbolism alike. Blake had long aligned herself with Swift, their friendship a badge of loyalty and power in the entertainment world. But now that very connection was being used as evidence to highlight contradictions in her defense. Taylor's absence during Blake's crisis did not go unnoticed. It echoed loudly through headlines and fandom circles, leaving people to question whether alliances in Hollywood are ever truly real or simply transactional relationships built for image. And influence this connection drew Ryan further into the shadows, his own friendship with industry icons. Now under quiet review, every photo, every collaboration now carried weight and meaning. The Toronto Film Festival had become the quiet epicenter of a storm that reached far beyond one marriage into the very machinery that keeps Hollywood spinning. Beneath the glamour, the truth was growing impossible to ignore. This wasn't simply about one couple falling apart, it was about how the system protects its own reputation even at the expense of the people inside it. Ryan Reynolds was beginning to understand that, to survive in Hollywood, you don't just play the game. You learn when to disappear from it. The unraveling of Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively's perfect facade didn't happen with a single scandal or a sudden explosion. It came quietly, layer by layer, moment by moment, until what once looked like a love story began to resemble a slow-motion separation played out under the eyes of the world. The distance between them became visible not in words, but in the empty spaces, the missed appearances, the way they began to exist in parallel rather than together. And the most haunting part was how normal they tried to make it. Blake continued appearing at her brand launches, smiling through the flashbulbs. Her confidence polished, but her eyes distant. Ryan focused on his creative projects, his interviews careful, his tone steady, but hollow insiders whispered that their communication had dwindled to strategy rather than intimacy. Each statement, each post a move in an invisible chess game designed to protect what little was left of their image. And as fans debated whether the couple was truly on the edge, the industry was already moving on. The story had evolved into something larger than either of them, a reflection of how Hollywood's most powerful figures manage crisis and perception. The same networks of publicists and legal experts that once elevated them were now calculating how to minimize the damage, because in Hollywood, when one image cracks, it threatens to expose the machinery behind the lawyers, the agents, the PR architects, the friends who turn silent when controversy strikes. The walls began to close in with every new rumor and every leaked whisper. Ryan's once untouchable charm was no longer enough to deflect questions, and Blake's silence was starting to look less like grace and more like strategy. Even their closest allies were quietly choosing sides, trying to predict which way the story would tilt, as one insider put it. No one wants to be standing on the wrong side of history when the headlines shift. But beneath all the noise, there was something profoundly human unraveling. Two people who had built their lives on laughter and lightheartedness, now trapped by the very narrative that made them famous. Ryan's decision to walk the red carpet alone had started a countdown, a sequence of events that could not be undone. Every interview, since every social media choice, every missing glance had become evidence to the public that their relationship was no longer the same. And though no official statement had been made, the silence itself had become the story. Their empire, built on charm, humor, and affection, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Because when fame and pressure collide, something always breaks. What once united them had turned into a mirror reflecting their differences. Blake's world was entangled in legal strategy, image control, and public defense. Ryan's world was about legacy, reputation, and calculated distance. Their love story that had once seemed effortless had become a negotiation of survival. And while the internet speculated, Hollywood insiders quietly agreed on one truth. This was not about who was right or wrong, it was about who could endure the spotlight longest. Because in that world, endurance is everything. The Toronto Film Festival will forever be remembered as the moment Ryan Reynolds stepped into the light alone, but it will also be remembered as the night he began to let go. Not in anger, not in betrayal, but in quiet resignation to a truth that fame had already decided for him when love becomes performance, and image becomes armor. There is no turning back, and though the world may continue to debate the details, the story of Ryan and Blake will remain a cautionary tale of how even the most beautiful illusion can collapse under the weight of reality in a Knive. The end, the Toronto red carpet, became more than a headline. It became a symbol of quiet endings and unspoken truths. It marked the moment Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively stopped being a story about romance and became a lesson about survival, about how fame tests even the strongest bonds, and how silence can speak louder than any statement Hollywood had built them up as the perfect couple, the ones who had it all: beauty, humor, love, and success. But beneath that perfection were cracks that only time and pressure could reveal. What audiences saw that night was not arrogance or detachment. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding too much for too long. Ryan's decision to stand alone wasn't defiance, it was self-preservation. A way of reclaiming a little control in a world that feeds on chaos. Blake's absence wasn't a scandal. It was strategy and maybe even surrender, because when every move is watched, every gesture dissected, sometimes disappearing becomes the only act of power left to you. What remains now is a strange quiet between them. The public still waits for answers, for explanations, for some moment of clarity, but those may never come. The truth is their story no longer belongs to them. It belongs to the narrative that Hollywood has already written for them, the one where love becomes content and heartbreak becomes currency. And as the lights fade and the cameras move on, the only thing left is the memory of what once looked so effortless, so genuine, and the reminder that even in a world built on illusion, reality always finds its way through the cracks, because behind every perfect photo, there's a silence we were never meant to hear, and behind every red carpet, there's a goodbye we never saw coming.